If you have ever read and heard about slavery details in depth, did you find out what was done with the black children slaves born on plantations? Until now, we have been told about the brutalities inflicted on black slaves. However, they only focus on black men and women. This intentional disclosure ensures that people only focus on certain things, missing the ones that reveal the real atrocities. Yet, if you want to know how horrific slavery was in the United States, you have to know what was done with the black children slaves. But what possibly could be done with them? Perhaps they could be used as servants in homes or could be beaten? Well, in reality, that's not a fraction of how their lives actually were. So what painful was done with the black children slaves that the history books today exclude? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will tell you about the slavery experience of black children slaves and the most shocking things done to them. Let's get started. During the era of slavery, the treatment of black children was beyond inhumane, driven by economic motivations and deeply rooted in racial dehumanization. The cruel practices that defined their lives were a reflection of how slaveholders balanced the costs of raising a child against the perceived future profits of their labor. Slave children were treated with the same disregard for human dignity as adult slaves, but often in even more extreme ways. Their food rations were consistently smaller than those of adult slaves because they were seen as future investments, not as immediate laborers. The idea was to keep them alive, but barely. The horrifying comparison to livestock feeding practices cannot be overstated. Slave children were often fed from communal troughs. The substance they were given was called pot liquor, a broth made from vegetable scraps, a diet that was intentionally meager to cut costs. As a result, malnutrition was common among black slave children, leading to widespread physical signs such as swollen bellies and shiny, stretched skin. These children were malnourished, often reduced to skeletons with glistening ribs. This malnutrition made them more vulnerable to diseases, which added to their misery. But things did not stop at food. The conditions in which black children lived were equally disgusting. Clothing was often an afterthought, and many slave children were left to roam plantations naked or with only the barest covering, a simple smock-like garment. Clothing was rarely replaced when outgrown or torn, leaving children exposed to harsh weather conditions. That's because slaveholders saw no value in investing in proper clothing for children who were not yet contributing significantly to the workforce. Similarly, housing for enslaved children was also inadequate. They lived in overcrowded slave quarters that could hardly be described as shelters. Some visitors to plantations romanticized these living spaces, calling them cottages or cabins, but this was far from the truth. These structures were often nothing more than hovels, cramped, damp, and lacking even the most basic sanitation. Disease spread quickly in these quarters, compounding the already dire situation for enslaved children. Yet the horrors of slavery did not spare children from the grueling life of forced labor. Even if they could not work properly, they had to be taught so they knew what their future was. Therefore, they were often put to work at shockingly young ages, some as young as 3 or 4 years old. The nature of their labor varied depending on the plantation, but it was common for young children to perform a range of tasks, from fetching water and tending to animals to working in the fields alongside their mothers. By the time they reached 8 or 9 years old, many were expected to take on more physically demanding tasks. Enslavers saw children as future assets, and so they initiated them into labor gradually but consistently. There was no distinction between childhood and adulthood. Slave children were raised in an environment where they were treated as small adults expected to work for the benefit of their owners. This brutal introduction to labor only hardened their dehumanized status. However, the most heart-wrenching aspect of life for slave children was the constant threat of being sold away from their families. Like adults, children were treated as property that could be bought, sold, or traded at any time. This fear was a constant reality. It was ignored that these children needed care and love from their slave parents. While some states eventually passed laws to prevent the sale of children under 10 years old away from their mothers, these laws were often ignored or loosely enforced. Children were still routinely separated from their families and sold to different plantations. The process of selling children was dehumanizing. Many were paraded naked on auction blocks, inspected by potential buyers as if they were cattle. Buyers would examine their teeth, bones, and overall physical condition to assess their value. Children were stripped of their dignity, and their sale represented the ultimate betrayal of the most basic human bonds. Even those children who remained with their families faced the daily trauma of knowing they could be taken away at any moment. The psychological trauma of living under the constant threat of separation was devastating. Many children witnessed their parents or siblings being sold, often without warning, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. However, the worst moment came for a Black child slave when they committed a mistake. Like their adult counterparts, slave children were not spared from the brutal physical punishments that were part of daily life on the plantation. Beatings were a common form of discipline, and enslavers used physical violence to enforce control and obedience. Some children were whipped for the smallest infractions, a method used to break them and instill fear at a young age. Others were forced to endure public punishments to set an example for their peers. This culture of violence was designed to crush any sense of autonomy or defiance in enslaved children, ensuring that they would grow up accepting their status as property. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. The emotional trauma inflicted on Black children during slavery cannot be overstated. From birth, they were treated as property, subjected to physical and psychological abuse, and forced to witness the suffering of their parents and peers. The lack of any familial security, the constant threat of separation, and the brutal physical punishments all contributed to a childhood filled with fear, uncertainty, and pain. Slave children faced escalating challenges as they grew older, particularly around the age of 10, when their lives took a harsher turn due to the brutal realities of slavery. At this age, they began full-time labor, moving beyond the lighter tasks they may have performed earlier. This transition marked the start of their deeper exploitation. For slave owners, these children were valued primarily for their labor, and as they aged, they became more integral to the workforce. Initially, they assisted older slaves in their tasks, but eventually, they replaced aging adults in more demanding roles. The specific age at which slave children began these regular duties varied, depending on the decisions of their owners and the size of the enslaved population on the plantation or household. Thomas Jefferson's instructions for enslaved children exemplify the cruel structure of labor imposed on the youngest members of the enslaved population. His guidelines were explicit. Children up to the age of 10 were expected to serve as nurses, taking care of younger children or assisting with other domestic tasks. At the tender age of 10, boys were placed into physically demanding roles, such as making nails, while girls were assigned to spin yarn or fabric, preparing them for a lifetime of hard labor. By age 16, these children were no longer considered children at all. They transitioned to adult roles, either working the land in the fields or learning a specific trade, becoming fully integrated into the labor force of the plantation. This rigid system of labor left no room for childhood. Regardless of whether they worked in labor groups or under a task system, enslaved children were forced to grow up quickly. The reality of slavery meant their lives were consumed by work from an early age, and they were seen primarily as tools for production rather than individuals with their own potential or future. The tender moments of childhood, such as playing or learning, were non-existent. Instead, they faced brutal training designed to prepare them for their roles as lifelong laborers. The personal accounts of former enslaved individuals like Mingo offer a haunting glimpse into the lives of these children. Mingo, who grew up in Franklin County, Alabama, recalled working from a very young age, often performing the same tasks as adult men. Despite being just a child, he was sent into the fields to hoe cotton, pull fodder, and pick cotton, working side by side with older, more seasoned hands. The labor didn't stop in winter either. Even during the colder months, Mingo would go out with the men to gather wood or sap to make turpentine and tar. He also participated in making charcoal, which was crucial for running the blacksmith shop. His childhood memories were filled with exhausting labor rather than the joys of youth. Mingo also helped his mother with her tasks, which were far too grueling for one person. She worked as a maid for Mr. White's daughter, cooked meals, and was required to spin and carve 4 cuts of thread per day, each cut consisting of 144 threads. Afterward, she would still have to complete additional chores, such as washing. The work never seemed to end, and it was too much for any one person, let alone a child, to handle. Yet slavery imposed such roles on children, forcing them into adult responsibilities far too early. The story of Mary Bell from Missouri offers another example of the varied tasks assigned to enslaved children. Her job was somewhat unique, as she was put on a pony during mealtime to ride out to the fields and call the workers to dinner. Though her task may seem simple, it was part of the larger machinery of plantation life that constantly reminded enslaved people of their subservient role, even as children. Similarly, William Hudson, who lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, recalled carrying a small black bag when his owner went out to treat people. This job, though different from field labor, was still another way in which enslaved children were integrated into their masters' daily lives, performing tasks that symbolized their submission and servitude. Whether they were purchased or raised within the household, small enslaved children were assigned duties that reinforced their place in the Southern social hierarchy. Plantation owners, in an effort to train children to understand and accept their subservience, often placed them in roles that required them to perform personal services for members of the white family. Boys and girls were positioned at the gates of plantations, ready to open and close them whenever a white family member or guest passed through. They were assigned specific tasks that suited the gender roles of the time. Girls typically served white women and their daughters, while boys attended to white men and their sons. Some enslaved children, like Lula Holmes Williams, were designated as companions for the white children of the household. Lula, despite being smaller than her charge, was responsible for making sure her owner's daughter, Miss Lucy, wore a bonnet whenever she went outside. Such roles might seem insignificant, but they were an essential part of maintaining the plantation's hierarchical structure. These children were constantly reminded of their lower status, and every task they performed, no matter how trivial, served to reinforce their position as property. But among these everyday tasks lay stories of profound tragedy. One particularly heartbreaking account is that of Harriet, a young enslaved girl who died tragically in 1855. Harriet, only 4 years old, fell into a well on the plantation of James M. Torber, an Alabama planter. Torbert's journal reveals the cold detachment with which he recorded her death, noting that Harriet was just 4 years, 3 months, and 3 days old when she passed away. Despite her young age, Harriet had been forced to work beyond her capabilities, which likely contributed to her tragic death. Torbert's journal mentions that, after her death, he crafted a coffin and buried her, adding a note of regret, but ultimately expressing a helplessness that masked the deeper injustice. Harriet's story was not an isolated incident. Earlier that year, Torbert had crafted another coffin for Arthur, another enslaved child who had died under his ownership. The high mortality rate among enslaved children, particularly in the grueling coastal rice-growing regions, was an unspoken tragedy of the institution of slavery. Black infants born into slavery were twice as likely to die as white infants, and even those who survived infancy faced harsh conditions that often led to their early deaths. The loss of enslaved children, while emotionally painful for enslaved parents, was often framed differently for slave owners. While they may have experienced some level of regret at the death of a child, it was more likely due to the loss of a potential worker than any genuine emotional connection. However, many plantation owners believed that raising enslaved children on their own plantations, rather than purchasing them from slave markets, led to stronger bonds between the enslaved individuals and the owners. They believed that children raised within the household would develop loyalty and obedience, seeing the plantation owner as a paternal figure. This was a delusion, as the bonds formed between enslaved children and their owners were based on coercion, not affection. Some slave owners believed that by allowing children to survive, even if this meant short-term profits from crops were reduced, they would benefit from a more loyal and stable workforce in the long term. Children raised on the plantation were seen as less likely to rebel or run away, as they had known no other life and had no connections to the outside world. This warped sense of paternalism was, however, underpinned by the same brutal system of control and exploitation that defined slavery. Here, the treatment of enslaved Black girls should be mentioned separately. That's because they were not just used as laborers, but as childbearers from a young age. In some places, breeding farms were established where enslaved girls were forced to bear children at a very young age. These young girls were treated as tools to produce more enslaved people who could be sold or used as labor. This practice further dehumanized them and ensured that their childhoods were short-lived and filled with trauma. What did you earlier think about Black children's treatment during slavery? Do you know about any historical accounts that reveal more about how horrifically Black children slaves were treated? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on how fear was instilled in Black children so they never resist when they grow up. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.